Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that a lot of people think that when we talk about the social doctrine of the church, which basically is to guide us on how to live our life in family, in the society, and in the business where we work or whatever profession that we carry out. A lot of people don't understand it, and they think that it is a new way. Usually people consider it socialistic in its approach. It's not. I had a friend of mine years ago who was an important fellow, a treasurer for a major oil corporation, and one time we were talking about social doctrine in general, and he said to me, social doctrine is here and reality is here, and they never meet. So it was a kind of a group session, and the following month we got together. I gave a 2-hour class on social doctrine. And after the class, he came up to me and he says, now I understand it goes like this. I never heard that before about what you said. Now, this is a fellow who's a very good Catholic, major oil corporation, and he didn't understand the doctrine of the church. Similar experience with Archbishop Fiorenza, who's a very dear friend. And Archbishop Fiorenza, at that time, he was president of the Episcopal Conference, and he was talking one night, we were having dinner somewhere, about immoral profits and windfall profits, things like that. And then I said, do you know what profit is all about in a corporation? And he really didn't. You know, we had a little class on minor economics and on the social doctrine, how it fits. And when it was over, he says, well, you ought to write a book. And I said, well, I wish I had the time to write a book. My thesis was my book, and it was a good thesis, but it's kind of ancient right now. In 1987, when I wrote it, there was nothing really out there in things having to do with economic, social doctrine, morality. My whole thing was, what is the morality of profit in the light of Catholic social doctrine? It was unusual, and it was very good for me because no one else had done it, so it made it easier. Since then, a lot of things have come out. There are a lot of good books out on the market right now, but I think probably one of the greatest books was one that was published by the Vatican, and it's called The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's a little bit like the Catechism. If you look through it, a good part, maybe a third of it, that's indices from here back, and the rest of it is doctrine. And it's basically doctrine that began in 1891, because that's really when social doctrine, in the modern sense, came into being, was 1891. Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which means on new things. Why did Leo XIII write that encyclical? At that time was the rise of industrialization. It was when factories were being developed. People were working poor people. They worked, but they never made enough money because at that time, labor, people who worked, were considered a commodity. And you got them cheaper if you controlled them. But you never thought about the person, you just thought about the money. So there was this major shift between the working force and the people who own capital. And Leo XIII realized it was going to open the door to a lot of difficulties, especially because in 1891, he was already taking into account Marx's publication in 1948 on communism. So he realized that this was opening the gate for a major problem in industry in the world. And he was right, pretty much. After that, we have the Russian Revolution. Russia and the Soviet Union took hold. I mean, the whole world became difficult with communism in various parts, not just in Russia, but even in South America and other places. So anyway, that was the beginning. This book is great because it's got a great index, and it points out a number of areas that you can look through in the index and just read about. You don't have to read the whole book. It mentions in one point that what we're trying to do in social doctrine is support the common good. Basically, we want to support the common good. What is the common good? Basically, it's giving everybody the opportunity to grow as a human being. Everybody to have access to things that will help them materially, but also help them culturally, like music and art and education. Things having to do with involving in civic responsibilities, as well as the spiritual. So That idea of the common good is what the church is trying to support with the social doctrine, not resting only on the revelation coming from God, but using our own natural reason. In other words, not just depending on theology, which some people will dismiss because it's Catholic, but the church is saying, no, we're talking about philosophy, what we understand with our own head and can prove regardless of revelation from God. The good thing about revelation is it helps us to go deeper, and in many ways it's kind of a shortcut to understand things that sometimes might be harder to understand. What is the central point of social doctrine? The central point is the human person. That's what we're interested in, the dignity of the human person. And that cuts across all borders, whether it's business, politics, medical profession, university, law, go down the line. All of those things is how do we help the human person to find God? But in the human level, also how to find his way in the common good, to make sure he has an access to this common good. So way back when, there were several documents over the years after Rerum Novarum, and I'll just go through them a bit just so you understand. These come from a document written by Benedict XVI, which was also facing social doctrine of the church, called God is Love. You may have read it, you may recall it, God is Love. And in the beginning of the document, he talks about what is love. And he kind of goes after, let's call it what it really is, not just sentiment. And then from that love, he says that love has to generate in us this desire to live out justice, as well as, turn this thing off, live out justice as well through that love. And in any case, some of the documents that we come through, I mentioned 1891, Rerum Novarum. The next major document was Pius XI's encyclical in 1931, which was on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. And what does he call it? The 40th anniversary, pretty much. That's what he calls it. In Latin, it's Quadragesimo Anno. Why do I say Latin? It's important to understand that the language of the church is still Latin, in case we forgot. It hasn't gotten lost. And the language of culture is Latin. For example, St. Thomas More, the publications that he wrote, which were very significant, a third of them were written in Latin. That whole generation, people wrote in Latin. That was the cultural language. If you want to understand culture and history, you have to know Latin. Otherwise, you're lost. Otherwise, you read translations. Thomas Aquinas, whose feast we celebrate today, January 28th, wrote in Latin. If you go through the Summa Theologia, you go through his other documents, it's all written in Latin. He was writing in the middle 1200s. And that was the language. So that's why Latin is important. And the church always uses the first two words, encyclical, in Latin to name the encyclical. So that's why it's Quadragesimo Anno. Then the next one is by John the 23rd, called Mater et Magistra. And that was in 1961, again, another anniversary. The one that he also published, or that Paul VI published, was Populorum Progressio, which was 1967. And I'm trying to remember, it was the anniversary of some particular document that came out. It may have been from the United Nations. Then the Apostolic Letter of Octogesima Adveniens also came from Paul VI. And then probably the one that was most important was Laborum Exercens, the exercise of work, by John Paul II in 1991. Now, you may remember that he was attempted to be assassinated. They tried to kill him, so the document came out later, because he hadn't finished it when they shot him. But it did come out shortly thereafter, and it's still dated as 1991. And then 1981, and then 1991, sorry, I'm getting lost in all these different documents, is Centesimus Annus, which I think is the greatest document that's come out recently. Centesimus Annus means the 100th anniversary. Again, so it's 1991 from 1891. What does he do in Centesimus Annus? He goes through Rerum Novarum 100 years later. Very impressive. What it tells you is that the first document by Leo XIII on new things, Rerum Novarum, was outstanding. And that's why the other popes wrote from that particular document in 1891. And in 1991, John Paul II used it. It's very funny because I had wrote this document on morality of profit in light of Catholic social doctrine, and there was nothing out there. So what did I do? I went through 1891 through all of the major documents till 1987. I went through all of the things that popes had said from Leo XIII on to John Paul II, which was a ton of work. There's an organization that publishes all the activities, all the speeches of the popes, everything that they say. So they have it in volumes, and I'd say Paul VI had a large shelf that was pretty much full, more or less, not quite. John Paul II, and this was still just the beginning of his papacy, more or less, he had like 2 shelves packed, and he probably had 2 or 3 more before he died. And so anyway, we went through these things and pull out what they're talking about. In Centesimus Annus, the Pope has a paragraph, has a chapter called Business and Profit. First time I've seen that kind of a way of looking at profit in a papal encyclical, Business and Profit. It's an important encyclical because it was really designed for everybody to read. Everybody. I mean, a businessman, a professional, anybody can read it and understand it. Why do I say that? Because John Paul II's encyclicals were very hard to read, generally speaking. You may not know this, but having read all of them, I can tell you. He did one on the Holy Spirit, just on the Holy Spirit. You could read that thing 100 times, and you still will not get the whole thing. It's brilliantly deep, philosophical. It's not theological, it's philosophical, more or less. A lot of his encyclicals were like that. But this one, Centesimus Annus, was much more appealing to the lay faithful. Something worthwhile to read. I think that's a good encyclical. I think Deus Caritas Est, Benedict XVI, is a very good encyclical, and I think this book is very good. So if you want to catch up on what is social doctrine all about, those are some basic ideas that you can do and understand more about social doctrine. In Laborum Exertions on carrying out work, John Paul II said, man has to subdue the earth and dominate it. Where do we understand that? You go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, that the parents were put in the garden ut operaretur, in order to work. And what do? They took care of the land. They were developing the land so that they could feed themselves and life, the people that they gave life to. So from the very beginning, we were made to work. That's who we are, is our work. Now, work isn't just professional work we get paid for, but it's work all across the border, whatever we do, which is pretty much work all the time. You know, if you're a mother, it's all the time. If you're a father, it's all the time. Now, sometimes fathers come home very often and they kind of forget about work at home because they work so hard all day and they just want to relax, you know. Meantime, the wife has worked hard all day and she's got to do dinner and take care of the kids and put them to bed, you know. So obviously in a lot of families now we've intermeshed these better, that the father plays a greater role. If you go to South America, it's quite different. We're still dealing with the machismo mentality where the guy is more important. I say that because Pope Francis has talked about that a number of times, as have the others, but Pope Francis comes from Argentina. So he comes from that world, and he understands it probably a little better than most of us. Although I must say, Argentina, sometimes they don't consider themselves Latinos. It's a very interesting. The Argentines consider themselves probably more European than Latinos, Hispanics. But anyway, still, it's South America. It's a different culture. So he says, because the image of God, he is a person, that is to say, a subjective being capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself with a tendency to self-realization. A person as a person, man is therefore the subject of work. Subject of work. So what is the Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II? I have a great devotion to him because he ordained me in the priesthood back in 1985. He was a great man, outstanding man, across the board. People don't realize how much he liked to ski. You know, sometimes we see how he skied every now and then. It would show up in the media. Well, he skied a lot more than that. The man who worked with him, Joaquin Navarro Valls, who was the spokesperson for the Vatican for about 25 years, a man who I know, and he went skiing with him quite often. It was sort of on the QT. Just for half a day, he would sneak out of Rome and go north and ski. One time he was in skiing, and they would have a ski guide as well as 2 or 3 people from the Vatican accompanying him. And one day they were skiing quietly, trying to stay out of the middle of things. And at one point he gets up on a ski lift to go back up to the top of the mountain. It's about midday, early afternoon, sitting with a little kid. So he starts talking to this kid as they're going up the mountain. And then after a minute, the kid looks at him and he says, "Aren't you the Pope?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am." So they got off the ski slope. He told the other people what happened. So they came down, took off their skis, got in their cars, and beat it out of there. So by the time the press got there, he was long gone. But that was the way he operated. So what's the subject of work? Well, there's 2 ways we look at work. One is the objective way. That is to say, what are we doing in our work? What's our service? What's the product that we're producing? We have to make it. Objectively, we have to turn this thing from nothing into reality. But the subject part of work is the person who does it. And the subject who does the work has to himself improve. Just as the object improves as it's developed, the person himself has to improve through his work. He has to grow. Part of it is he has to understand that he has a relationship to his work, because that's who he is and that's how he identifies himself. You know, in the very beginning of the world, man understood who he was by the work that he did. We look at Jesus Christ. His work was as a carpenter. Very interesting. He could have done something else, but his father's work was a carpenter, and maybe his grandfather. And so he becomes a carpenter. What does that mean as a carpenter? Well, it means he has to have a shop, he has to buy tools, he has to buy wood, he has to work out deals with the people who come in order to make a chair, a cupboard, a bed, table, chairs, whatever you want to go down. You know, perhaps you've seen The Passion of the Christ, where they have that little joke where our Lord comes out with a table that's like our height. Because in those days, people sat at a low table and they spread out, lying down to eat rather than sitting up. So he comes along with a table that's higher. And Mary, his mother, is looking at this saying, "Well, what are we going to do with this?" He said, "No, this is a new way of looking at things." You know? Sort of maybe a reminder of the new way he was going to bring into the world by his preaching the word. So he shows her the table, and she's just perplexed by the whole thing. Well, you know, here we are with tables all over the place. Our Lord was a prophet in many different ways. So the subject of work has to grow. Now, a lot of people don't think about that aspect. Our main thing is, I want you to get the job done, period. Get the job done. I don't care how you do it, get the job done. In professional work, you've experienced that, and sometimes you realize that get the job done is not respecting my dignity. For example, Friday afternoon, your boss comes to you because there's a big lawsuit coming up. Either you're a lawyer or you're in the midst of it and a businessman, and he says, we have to have this whole thing squared away, ready Monday morning. What does that mean? It means you're going to work the whole weekend. That means Sunday's out the window because you're going to work from early morning to late at night. A friend of mine is a lawyer in Houston. When Enron was going to be bought by Dynamo, this company, they were going to go out. It was Dynamo or Dymo. I'm terrible on names. The chairman of the company calls him up and says, "Listen, come up here right now. We're going to buy Enron." So I hang up the phone, and this guy thought, this is crazy, you know, because Enron was already down the tubes. So the idea was they were going to buy it, fix it up, sell it, I don't know what, incorporate it. He lived in Houston. He spent 22 days in a hotel working out this deal. He never went home, never saw his wife, never saw his kids. That was his work for 22 days. Then the whole thing fell through, thanks be to God, you know, because it was crazy. The whole thing was crazy. But 22 days in the same city, I mean, now is that respecting the human person? I'm not so sure, really. It changes his life in a significant way that's not really subjectively good for his development as a man, as a worker, as a lawyer, as a civic person, because you're cut off from society even in that regard. So the subject and then the object, they work together. We always have to keep two things in mind, the subject and the object. What happens with morality of profit? Profits are always good because you can't have a business without profit, obviously. If you have a business without profit, it collapses. But it has to have profits. It may have to have a lot of profits to do what it has to do, or fewer profits. Sometimes it has a lot of profits, and what do they do with the profits? Well, if the basic thing is what we're trying to do is create things well and take care of the dignity of the human person, that's good use of the profits. If all we're trying to do is create things reasonably well, we don't really care about the human person, just get it done, that's called the maximization of profits. Now, that doesn't mean there's a quantity increase. It means the attitude has changed towards profit. It's about me, it's about the executives, it's about the money that we get, rather than the human person. I worked on Wall Street for a number of years. I've sort of forgotten a lot about Wall Street because it's been so many years. People still ask me every now and then, oh, you worked on Wall Street. What do you think of this stock? I have no idea. So what happens is that people very often, in a sense, get caught up in making money. I think a lot of the things that are used, for example, derivatives that are used on the market, a lot of times you wonder, what does this do to contribute to the market or not? It almost seems it's just a method of generating profits for the corporation. And we see that sometimes because, as we've seen, certain corporations are on both ends of the deal, a straddle. So either way they go, they're going to make money. If it goes up, they make money. If it goes down, they make money. Now, what is that? I'm not answering the question, but I ask the question that we all have to ponder. What's going on here? What does this do for the human person? One of the things about the SEC that's very important on Wall Street is they want to have a fair and orderly market. In other words, Wall Street is not a free market. Sometimes Pope Francis will condemn the idea of resting on free market principles to control society. I agree. Every capitalist agrees. Capitalist. I say capitalist because there are no capitalists, truly, in the United States. Capitalist is total libertine. Anything is the market. Years ago, I had a conversation with William Simon. Some of you may remember William Simon. He was a great guy, wonderful man, brilliant, made a lot of money. But his whole idea was that everything could rest on the market, including abortion. Everything would be controlled by market forces. If it's good, people buy it. If it's not good, it disappears. Now, obviously, I didn't agree with that, and he did at that point. Later on in life, he had an adjustment, and I think he began to see more the importance of having order in the market. It can't be a free market. And that's what Wall Street is about, to avoid the Depression of 1929. There has to be orderly aspects in the market to protect it. Has to be fair. Can't have big people pushing little people around, which is what happens right now. If you work on Wall Street, you want to know what the institutions are going to do. The major pension funds, because they're going to come in, and when they buy shares, they're going to buy 250,000 shares. Well, now, if you go out and buy 250,000 shares, that thing is going to go up. And if you're a little guy, you want to know that, so you go up with it. But if you know that the wrong way, then you go to jail, because you're not allowed to operate on inside information. Interesting. Now, some people know that, and they buy, and they never get caught. But it means that the elephants at times are controlling the market for the little people. It's not entirely fair, and there are ways to improve it, but those are the things that we're looking at. So anyway, one of the parts of work is that a man, church teaches, must feel like he's working on something that is his own. It's not somebody else's that he's working on, but this is my work. This is what I own, taking care of this. In the old days, in farming, it was clear, because you got the land. The United States had the Homestead Act. You got the land. You took care of the land. As long as you took care of the land and made a living out of it. It was your land. So it was the way of giving private property to people according to their work. In the farming community, it's the same thing. You work the land, and then it becomes your land because you worked it. In the industrial age, it doesn't work on a factory so easily. Sometimes it does because the corporation gives profits to the people on the staff, so it brings them into realizing that this company is partly my own because I receive profits from the stock. These are ways that we can make the man, make the woman more dignified in the way they do their work. So we have the subjective and the objective. And how do we enhance those things? There's 4 basic principles that I'll share with you. If I have enough time, my idea is that we'll talk a little bit and then have a question and answer period, because I get the most out of questions and answers than out of talking. 4 things. The first is the right to private property. Right to private property is not absolute. It doesn't mean that you have a right and that's it. You have a right subject to the good of the country, subject to the common good. In other words, if you have lots of property, as you might have in the Philippines years ago or in Central America, and you did nothing with it, then it's not really your property because you're just sitting on it. It's not going anywhere. In that regard, there have been times when people say, well, let me distribute, like the United States government, let me distribute this land to the poor people so they all have their 10 acres and they take care of their 10 acres and they live off that. So it's private property, but in a sense, it's not absolute. I have to give in on certain cases for the good of the society. Interesting, and you may have questions about that, and it's very important that there is private property. Because if there is no private property, everything collapses. That's why the church condemns socialism, collectivism, communism, things like that. What happens in those situations is there is no private property. It's all owned by the state. You do what the state tells you, and that's it. So you have to have it. In the beginning, how did God do it? He gave it to Adam and Eve. And this brings us to the second important point, the universal destination of goods. Interesting phrase, universal destination of goods, which means every person who's born has a right to live. And that means some way or another, he needs to do that. He has to have the property, or he has to have some situation where he earns an income. And that income is the way he enters into private property. With that money, his money, he takes care of his family. He saves for when he retires, so on. So this idea of universal destination of goods is that everybody has to have a part of creation in order to survive. What does that mean in the long run? It means that we can't overlook the personal dignity of every person to have his own life. Even if the person is debilitated, drug addict, just like a person is a child or an elderly person or a person who's debilitated, they have the dignity of a human being because they're made in the image and likeness of God, so we have to take care of them, even though sometimes they can't cooperate the way they should. I had an opportunity to go through Skid Row here in Los Angeles. I met a lot of homeless people in Houston, got to know a number of them. And in all my time in Houston, I never saw a homeless person get violent, never. And Houston has about 50,000 homeless people. Los Angeles, they say, has 38,000. I think that's a low number myself. But anyway, 50,000, you could always talk to them, wonderful people. You had to get through the alcohol and the drugs and all the hang-ups, but some of them were wonderful people. What happened to them? A lot of them were, at that time, were veterans of the Vietnam War. Now a lot of them are veterans of Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Poor people. But those people, when you meet them on Skid Row and you walk through Skid Row, a lot of those people come up and they ask for a blessing, or they want to talk to you because you're a priest. They'll talk to anybody if you're normal, because first they want to ask for money. I was famous in Houston because I never gave out any money. I go down the street dressed like this to eat lunch, and people come up, Father. After a while, I just explain to them, look, if I gave all you guys money every day, we'd be broke. We support Catholic Charities. We support St. Vincent de Paul. We do all kinds of things to take care of the poor. If I give you the money, I don't know where it's going to go. They say, well, no, it's to eat. I said, all right, let's go down and get a hot dog. Well, no, I'd rather have cash. Sorry, Charlie, that's how it works. But these people still have dignity, real dignity, because they're human beings. One of my most interesting things in Houston was this man on the corner for years, a couple of years at least, African-American, thin as a rail, always in DTs, sitting on the edge of the curb, just shaking around. And I'd always say hello to him, like to talk to him, say something. And he would just listen and he'd be out of it. Sometimes he was a little more normal, he could look at you, but he was in bad shape. One day, I came off, parked the car, go around the corner. This is right in the center of downtown, the middle of Houston. Go around the corner, and he's on the corner standing there. He says, Father. I said, yeah, what's going on? He says, I want you to have this Bible. So I said, well, you need a Bible. Why are you going to give me this Bible? He says, no, here's my Bible, but I want you to have this Bible. So he reaches down in his filthy bag at his feet. He pulls out this Bible, and he hands it to me. Obviously, I was very impressed at his thought in all his craziness to say this. And then he said, can we pray? And I said, sure. So we opened the Psalms, we prayed some Psalms, we talked. And then he said, thank you very much. And I went back to the chapel, and he went back to the corner, hanging out, doing nothing. I mean, to me, it's a great example of the dignity of these people, as bad as they get. And all of you probably in your families have run across people who've come out of alcoholism or drug addiction, and you know that maybe they were in the pits. One of my best friends at Merrill Lynch, I'm getting off the topic a little bit here, but he was arrested about 50 times. He was a multimillionaire, but he was arrested about 50 times because he was a drunk. My age, just a great guy, but he was a drunk. Finally, he pulled out of it, he pulled himself together. He got married, he has a family. And, to admire him a lot because of what he's done. But when he got down in the pits and everybody abandoned him, at one point it finally clicked. I got to do something. But it took a lot. Anyway, so these two things, universal destination of goods, private property. Third thing is solidarity. You heard solidarity a lot. In Poland, that was the labor union's name, Solidarity, which was a little play on words that was going on. Solidarity, in the simplest term, is everybody is responsible for everybody. That's in the shortest phrase I can put it. But that covers it. Everybody is responsible for everybody. So nobody's isolated. Nobody can cut himself off. We have to be conscious of people around the world and what we do, which wasn't the case when some of these encyclicals were written, but now it's the case because we're on the internet. We're in touch with people all over the world by the internet. That globalization that's taken place, in a way, opens up the doors for us to live solidarity even better because we're aware of what's going on by the news and by direct conversation with people who are from places where there's a lot of poverty difficulties or a hurricane or an earthquake or some other kind of crisis. We don't have time to go through all this globalization and secularization, which are two other elements, but still, we can reach out to people more than ever in our society. And again, in business, everything was made in the USA for years, and that was good. But now, the classic thing is you can get a Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. It's a beautiful little plastic statue of a Lady of Guadalupe, and you turn it over and it's made in China. Okay, that's unbelievable. Why? Because it's cheaper in China than Mexico. And Mexico is cheaper than the United States, which is why we have all these factories along the border creating cars. And the cars from those factories are better than the cars that come out of our own plants, believe it or not. And who are the best people to work in those plants? Not men, women. Women are the best workers in that work. So what happens, you have a lot of women who don't have a chance to be a mother, or they do, but they have to abandon their kids. And then the men just can't find jobs because their wives find jobs because they're more attractive. And down there, you don't have to worry about discrimination. You don't have to worry about all the stuff. I spent 25 years in Texas. We have no labor unions. The laws, you can start your business in about 24 hours, maybe less. You go down the list, Texas is the other end of freedom compared to California, which, as a New Yorker, I can still see how California is a long distance away from the rest of the world in sort of being open about certain things. So anyway, I forgot where I was. Solidarity. So that's the whole point. We have to take that into account. The fourth one is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is basically that a senior organization can't take care of the work that a junior organization should take care of. Classic example. The best way, I think, to take care of schools is a school board in that town or the neighborhood of that town. And yeah, they have guidance from different sources and things like that, but they take care of their kids in their town, which are different from the kids in the next town, or kids from Dubuque, Iowa, from the Bronx. I mean, obviously, there's big differences. Omaha is a lot different than Houston, quite a bit. So you need those organizations at the ground level. But then after a while, people on top want to control it. So in a sense, the federal government gets too involved, and it violates the principle of subsidiarity. Why is that important? Because you're taking responsibilities away from the people who should have them, rather than controlling them. Sometimes you can control for a period of time when there's a problem at the lower level. But once that's done, you give it back to the people at that level. So, you know, in a country there's an earthquake, obviously everybody's taking care of each other, but it's a national emergency. And so the federal government, the top government, has to get involved. But that doesn't mean they enter into the person's lives forever. You know, sometimes they do, which is not right. So those four principles, that's the backbone of Catholic social doctrine. And we have to take those into account to respect the dignity of each person that we work with, live with. And that includes not only in society in general, common good, but also includes in whatever profession we work at, and it includes our own family, which is sometimes harder than anywhere else to respect the dignity of the other persons. But I think in this whole notion of respecting dignity, it's a challenge for us, a big challenge as Catholics, because what Pope Francis keeps hitting on over and over again is that we have to carry out evangelization in every corner of our lives. Not going to church on Sundays only, not praying in the family only, not belonging to an organization in the parish only. No, we have to evangelize in every single spot where we are, in our professional work above all. How do I evangelize in my professional work? Well, first I have to pray. I have to pray. I have to pray for the other people I deal with. A friend of mine was a lawyer in his law firm, and he was complaining to me one day, a wonderful guy, by the way, wonderful guy, but he's complaining about his employees. And sometimes these employees drive him crazy, and this department drives him crazy, and so on and so forth. He was a little bit upset about the way they acted. And I said to him, instead of thinking of them as employees, why don't you think of them as souls? You know, you're Catholic, you're a serious Catholic, they're souls. Now, do you want to have the same attitude towards souls that you want towards a head in your department or not? You know, he's very struck by that. And a number of times he came to me afterwards, he said, that changed me when you said that. It suddenly made me wake up to who I was. I said, well, that's the point. How do we do that? I was talking to a cardiologist, my own cardiologist, wonderful man, Episcopalian, and I bumped into this with a number of doctors, good doctors, is that there's no respect for the human person in medicine. It's not there, unfortunately. It's become a business. Too much. Insurance has forced it into that. And he was upset that he saw younger colleagues, it's not that they gave it up, they never got it in their training. And they're looking at the protocol, what they're going to do, what the drugs, what the surgery, and they're not looking at the person. Another friend of mine is in charge of transplants at Methodist Hospital in Houston. Methodist Hospital is famous for transplants because that's where Michael DeBakey did the first transplant in the country, one of the first transplants. He once had a patient sent to him from Ohio to Houston, a woman in a wheelchair with arthritis in her legs. She had some problems with her kidneys. Brought her in, and his entourage, younger doctors, he said, you tell me if this woman's qualified for heart transplant. And a little bit testing them. Well, several weeks went by, tests, I studied it, had the meeting, and they said, well, we decided, according to all the protocols, everything we found that yes, this is a good candidate for heart transplant. And he just had to say, you guys, don't you understand? You looked at everything but the person. She can't walk, her kidneys don't work. You know, you can tell me what it says on the charts, but how are we going to give a heart transplant to this woman when we have many younger people who will benefit? Because at her age and her circumstances, she gets the heart transplant, other things are going to go wrong. But that means they don't pay attention to the patient. Famous thing is John Paul II, when he was in the hospital after he had his cancer, he was with a colostomy. Temporary colostomy, but it was a colostomy. And if you don't know what a colostomy is, you can ask somebody else, but everybody knows what it is. It's very annoying, especially if it's lifetime. Anyway, he had this, and before he went home, he wanted it out, fix it. And they said, well, you know, it's not really, we don't think it's right. He says, no, fix it. I'm not leaving until you fix it. And then all these doctors got together and said, well, we all agree that we can't do it now. You have to go home and maybe in a month or two come back and we'll do it. And he says, you know what? I don't care what the doctors say. I'm the patient. I'm the one that calls the shots. Take it out. I know I'm going to survive it. Do it. I'm not leaving. So they took it out. He had no problems. You know, but it was the whole notion that I'm the patient. Don't tell me what I have to do. Now, obviously, we have to do what the doctor says, but we still have to have that notion of our own subjectivity, our own being subject to God through our own being a human person that I have to develop, as well as producing good products and making a profit for the company. Anyway, those are some ideas. Hope I haven't confused you too much, but I would invite you, if you have any kinds of questions, you can accuse me of whatever you like. Yes?
You were speaking of globalization.
Yes.
And a big controversy is the exploitation of jobs in the United States, to say India, wherever.
Right.
You are, on the one hand, obviously benefiting a person in India that is not employed, but
Right.
the argument is you're taking it away from someone who could be employed here. How do you square that?
That's our struggle. That's what we're reaching. One of the things we have as Business Ethics Forum is we're reaching CEOs, CFOs, COOs, executive vice presidents, people who make a difference, and say, you're doing this, is that right? Now, if I talk to an entry-level person or a lower management person, they can't make a change. But you talk to the CEO and you say, is this really right? First off, as you say, it's better to sort of save the money, but you go down to Mexico and you see the way these people live, it's not very good. You know, Nike got caught with it in Central America, that they live very primitive lives. Are they making more than before? Yeah, they are, but the company is taking advantage. This is where labor and capitalization bang, because these guys know there's no jobs down here, they're desperate for jobs, we can buy them cheap. You can't treat labor like you can do wood or metal or whatever else you want. And that's what they're doing, buy cheap. And they can say, well, they're better off than they were. Yeah, but has it respected their dignity or not? So you're right. The question is, how do we make that work together better? Yes?
I think to add, there was actually an investigative report on the LA Times specifically about these types of jobs going into Mexico.
Right.
A lot of agriculture, for instance. I mean, they're mega companies in Mexico, for instance, that actually bring product to the U.S. and
Right.
obviously produce that is affordable.
Right.
They even actually listed the number of supermarkets and retailers that actually were customers of these Mexican companies. But these people were being just mistreated. I mean,
Right.
Talk about dignity. They're completely stripped of their dignity.
Absolutely.
And really, the idea was, well, if you complain, leave. We won't pay you.
Yeah, but
Just won't pay you.
that's not fair.
Yeah. And it was, I would encourage everybody, it was a 3-part series that was done about a month and a half ago.
I remember that.
It was very, very well done.
Good.
Very well done.
Yeah, excellent background. Yes?
Father, we hear in the news that the top 1% control 50% of wealth.
Right.
When I began my career in the early 1950s, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 company made 40 times the entrance level salary.
Right.
Today that exceeds 400 times
That's right.
the entrance salary. How do we change that dynamic if as a society we're going to get better?
Well, I can't give you a simple answer because there's a lot of people involved, but that is a problem. You know, in Japan, it's still down around 50/1 for a Japanese CEO, but in the United States, it took off. Why? Why do we pay a basketball player $47 million to play basketball? You know, I mean, I'm not judging anybody, but I look at the system and I say, what's going on? Why does he form part of that over 50%? Then maybe be below that, and other people could have a chance into that
I have an
program.
answer, please.
Yes,
Is the rapport between demand and supply. We don't have too many players. That's the reason we pay them 40 millions.
right,
We don't have too good CEOs
right,
that make money. So, talking about morality, we gotta don't forget to look at the competitivity.
right, we do. There's no two ways about it, but it's a fair and orderly market. It's
How
not
do
a
you-
free market on
I know how to
competition.
educate these people
Right.
to don't accept 400 times more.
That's right. Well, that's what the Business Ethics Forum is all about. And I want to start one in Houston, I keep saying that, Los Angeles. It's a great program, but you're absolutely right. Yes,
So this fairness standard that you're referring to, are you saying that the United States sets that standard globally? Because
No.
it seems like the church doctrine, this should be a universal doctrine,
right,
but it seems like everything you're saying, you're comparing it to standards here in the United States, which those standards aren't applicable to Southeast Asia and
Right.
other parts of the world.
right,
So to be a man for others and to do your job and help society, I think you can do that with recognizing a free market society, recognizing capitalism.
right.
And not applying standards that may be germane here in the United States to another country.
Right, good point. First thing, I'll just say, we're not capitalists. I said it before, we're not pure capitalists. Now, we lean towards the capitalistic side of the market, but we're not. And that's why I say we want a fair and orderly market, the stock exchange. Now, it's universal doctrine, but every country has its own problems in different ways, but they all have the same problems. How does Mexico deal with it compared to the United States? There's a lot of corruption in Mexico. Much more than in the United States. It's something that began with the beginning of the country. Remember, in the United States, at least in the New England part, which, as Archbishop Gomez points out, that's a very small part, since most of the country was done by Latinos, when you think about it. But we think of George Washington and company. What was I going to say? My mind goes out of it. Anyway, the whole point is that everybody has different ways of looking. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Those people were basically bringing in virtue, basically from the Enlightenment. You look at John Adams, Jefferson, George Washington, these were impressive men as far as virtue. If you look in Mexico, for example, they were Spaniards that came in and took over. And their interest, unfortunately, was power and money, not the good of the human person. I would say that in the East, they were looking for the good of the human person. That's why they came, because it wasn't in Europe, so they came here. You go to Nigeria, it's terribly corrupt. Filthy rich, terribly corrupt. I had a friend live there for 14 years. His mother would send him stuff. He said, I never got anything that was sent. Because the whole crazy thing of corruption. Now, that's a different area, what we're talking about, the lack of respect for the human person. It's about me getting the money I want, and I will pay anything to pull it off that way. We've done that too. I worked for Gulf Oil years ago. They were in big trouble with paying off the Koreans to create systems, and they got caught, and they had to pay the price. And now how many banks are going through that now, are being fined by SEC or the US government? So it's universal doctrine, but it's going to be applied differently in different parts of the world. Different aspects are going to be important for them. I speak more of the US because we're citizens of the US, so I use that as examples. But you're right, it's universal.
But doesn't that doctrine then change? I mean, it seems like it's a tiered system that, look, here in the United States, there's a reason that unions evolved. The Industrial Revolution, we needed them.
Right.
Do we need them at the same level today? I don't think so.
Right.
Does it mean that you don't respect the dignity of a worker? Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, going back to your very first premise saying that, Adam and Eve were put on the world to work, shouldn't there be some pride in your job, no matter what that is?
Right.
Whether you're a CEO of a company or a guy who digs ditches, dig them the best you can.
That's right. But the unions are one aspect. In this country, the unions worked in certain places at certain times, but the doctrine hasn't changed, that you have to respect the dignity of the worker. Why do we have unions? Because there was no respect for the dignity of the worker. So the unions had to come together as labor in mass, instead of one after another, after another, after another, facing up to impossible situations. So they came together in mass and they had changed the country. Some of the times years ago, they were trying to increase the unions, and we don't understand compared to other parts of the world, but you go into the Midwest, and a guy works for GM or some other corporation. He's got a fairly decent house, fancy, but decent house for his family. He's got a car. He might have 2 cars. He has a fairly decent vacation, a week or 2 somewhere. That's not what happens in Italy. That's not what was happening in Spain in those years. So the unions couldn't get into those places because everybody says, well, I don't need a union. I'm very happy with what I have. Texas, we have no unions. Maybe that's not good, but that's the way it is. But the principle is the same, that we have to respect their right to get what they need. And if we don't, then they're going to use unions or something else that they'll do in order to get control, which is legitimate. And by the way, sometimes the unions can go to the other side of the spectrum
Exactly.
because they get carried away. Yes?
What does the doctrine say, and what's the line it draws with how much profit is too much profit for a company? How does that work, doctrine and theological wise?
Well, it's not too much profit, it's how is the profit used. So you can get some companies that make a lot of profit, like sometimes you gotta realize the oil companies made a lot of profits. I'm not defending the oil companies. I work for Gulf Oil, we make a lot of profits. In the chemical business, we're losing it in the oil business. We're making it in the chemical business. But this is in the 70s, different world. It was before we had ABS, this was before we had engineering plastics. What was your question again?
So,
You have to forgive me, my mind
it's
doesn't
kind of
work that well.
relative to a very major conversation that our country's having about companies with enormous profits and they're sitting on.
Okay, fine. So
So
what
walking
happens,
through kind of the doctrine of that, and
Right.
most companies would say, they're saving it for a rainy day because they don't know what's coming with.
and that might be legitimate.
So
For
is
them, that might be
right?
legitimate.
Okay.
But the point is that they're using it to enhance the subjective dimension of the people, which if you have enough profits, you might send your people to college at night and you'll pay for it because the company needs that, you have the money, let's go for it. Objectively, you might build better products by having better machines. To get the better machines, we have to pay for the research. Paying for the research costs money. Building new machines costs money, but we turn out a better product. So all of these things determine what profit is all about, but it's the 2 things, the objective and the subjective are supported. Now, if all the company wants to do is pay huge bonuses to all the top executives, you've got to question that. In the United States, I don't know what it is right now, but it's usually the typical CEO lasts 5 or 6 years in the company. Now, a guy who's CEO for 5 or 6 years, how much does he really care about the company? All due respect. At times, there is a sense, I do well here, I move on to the next company, get more money, bigger company, whatever the case is. So, in a sense, it can be greedy. What was it, Ivan Botsky, years ago, Wall Street, and he said, Wall Street's all about greed. I didn't agree with him, but that's what he said, and that's the way he thought, and he was a very, very powerful man. So I think that's where the profits come in, of being maximization, because I'm maximizing the profits, but I'm putting these 2 things, or one of these 2 things aside. So I could have a small profit or a big profit, but I'm maximizing profits in that situation. So physically, I could have a lot of profits. How do I use them? Do I support those 2 areas of creation? Person
That
and
same
work.
philosophy applied to individual wealth?
Yeah, sure. Same thing. That's why the thing of CEOs making so much money, what do you do with all that money? Some of them invested very well, and that's a good thing, but some of them don't. Or maybe not as well as they could. And I'm not saying you can judge everybody's investment, but I do think it's something that everybody has to reflect on, something you have to think about. Am I really doing things that are useful? The other thing about this objective creation too is you can have a product that makes you a lot of money, but it's useless. I went to Mexico years ago. I was in a crummy town, dirt roads, dirt inside the houses. The houses were very simple, poor people. Every house had a TV antenna. All right. Maybe that's good, certain ways. But maybe sometimes we go into a market and we're selling the item and we're not really thinking about whether this is useful to this market, but we make money, so we sell it. Again, now is that maximizing profits? I think it is. I think our return is more important than what do these people really need at that time in their circumstances. Those are examples anyway. Yes?
I hear a lot of young people today who are working for startups, and that is a term that's relatively new to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I just stop and wonder why so many young people are thinking about what can I do to make money really, really quickly? Is this
Right.
product really needed? But it's
Right.
just to like generate an interest in, can I sell this to
Right.
somebody? And then
Right.
it's picked up by a Wall Street, a big corporation, but what are they really manufacturing? What are
That-
they really doing?
It's a good question. You know, sometimes it's a very good thing and their heart is into it because it's a very good thing. Sometimes they're not quite sure what they're going down the road at, but they go down the road because it looks good and I will get equity, hopefully, if I start out, if I'm in the startup. I won't just get a salary, I get equity, which in the long run is great because that means you get money down the road even when you quit, because that's one of the ways that you participate in the company. But if the product is a waste of money, then you have to think twice. Why am I getting involved with this startup? Maybe there's a better startup I can work for that's going to produce something that's worthwhile. So yeah, it's a small decision. But coming back to this whole idea of young people in startups, my own experience is that we're going through a generation shift. And my parents' generation and your parents' generation worked very hard to get where they are in most cases. Some of them were dirt poor. My 4 grandparents came from Ireland, dirt poor. My parents brought us up in our education, even though they never went to college. And in my family of 5 kids, 3 of us have doctorates. One has a master's, and the other one has her bachelor's degree, and she's filthy rich. Very generous with her money, very generous with her money. But I'm thinking, my sister was in Ellis Island, which is where my grandparents all came through. Now it's a museum. She was working for a major investment firm, so was her husband. At that time, I think they were just married. They're standing in Ellis Island on the main plateau at night, stepped out of the party, and they both had glasses of champagne. And they're standing there and thinking about their grandparents. They have their champagne. And my sister says, could you imagine that my grandparents would think that I would stand here and have a glass of champagne on the place they crossed to come to the United States? That's America, you know? But I think we have a younger generation that is more or less selfish. You see it by the cell phones. Big isolationism. People are caught in their own world by the cell phones. Terrible. In Houston, I'd watch all these people going to dinner. You'd see 5 or 6 people going out to lunch somewhere, and they're all on the cell phone. When they get into the restaurant, they're probably still going to be on the cell phone. Why go out to lunch together? You know, it's just, I think what happens is they want to live the life that you live, but they're not going to make that kind of income. So they want to be in the same country club, they want to drive the same cars, they want to have the same vacations that you worked to develop to be able to do. They have to do it like you did to get there. But they won't. You know, the debt that young people have on credit cards is enormous. And these are educated people. But they want to keep up with sort of the life that they were brought up in with their parents' household. But they really can't. A lot of them, anyway, really can't. So I think there's a certain self-centeredness on this younger generation. And that's something that I think Pope Francis is going after. I mean, this is the evangelization. These people have to wake up what life is all about. And then hopefully learn generosity and have a better vision of what their work is really about. Yes?
Father, in light of what you're saying of Catholic social doctrine, what is it that you're urging us as individual Catholics to do or to be in the world? What actions should we be taking?
Okay. I think the first thing is I don't have solutions, but you have to think and reflect on what I'm talking about. And it's going to have different aspects for each of you in what area you are involved with. And even if you don't work professionally for a check outside the home or you're retired, you still have areas that you can develop and think more about this. And we have to come up with conclusions. You know, I think for years sexual ethics was #1 in the Catholic Church. And I think we've reached the point where it's more or less clear what you should do. Now, do people do it? That's one of our problems, but it's clear. Social ethics is still not that clear. It's a very rich area that we still have to explore, but I'm giving you the 4 principles, and you can read the other details and know where am I going in my own area. I think that's #1. I think #2 is prayer. I think we have to learn how to pray. We have to pray for the people around us, and we have to pray all the time. When you go to work, and I worked for me for years, you go to work and you have to have something on your desk to remind you that you're Catholic. You have your wife's picture on the desk, your husband's picture on the desk, you have your kids on the desk, whoever you have on the desk, because you're saying, well, these are important to me. Maybe I can hide a crucifix somewhere in that small thing. Or maybe I can hide an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I used to have a medallion that somebody gave me in Europe, and on the reverse side of the medallion was Our Lady with the child. And so I leave it on my desk as a paperweight, and that would be my reminder. Because obviously I'm not going to, generally at Wall Street, you don't want to call too much attention to the fact that you're praying. Except I worked with the #1 guy, John Reynolds, quite a guy. And when the market was going down the tubes, he'd be in the back of this room of 100 brokers, you know, a big bullpen. And he says, okay, we're going to pray the rosary now, Our Father, blah, blah. You know, Notre Dame grad, okay? So it's just... But he's right. Now, he was fooling around, but he's right. We have to say, well, am I praying? When I work, what do I think about? What am I working for? Is this bringing me closer to God? Am I giving greater glory to God in this work, or what? To think about that. And I think we can all improve on that, one way or the other. Even you do housework. It's a pain in the neck, a lot of it, you know. But that's not wrong. That's who we are. That's our work. Like it or not, you know. Maybe you're living in the wrong house. Maybe you married the wrong guy. I don't know what happened. But the point is, this is what God wants me to do every day. A friend of mine was the CEO of a fairly large, the largest actually, credit union. For a number of years, he kept telling me, I want to step down, I want to become a medical missionary, do something really direct for the church. And I'd say, no, you're CEO, that's where you belong. You're implementing Catholic doctrine in your corporation without calling it that, but that's what he was doing. The corporation's changed, morale is up, profits are up, you've opened new branches, and you know it's got to do with your way of doing things. He said, I know that. That's why you're there. Don't quit that job because that's not what God wants you to do. Anyway, he go back and forth, back and forth. Long story short, he bumps into Scott Hahn at a particular thing. He wasn't a fan of Scott Hahn at first, but eventually Scott Hahn invited him to go to his house. So he went up to his house in Steubenville and spent a long weekend. Came back and he says, you know, all those years you told me that, I finally understood what you were saying. So then he realized I have to be a good CEO. And that's my way of giving God glory in what I'm doing in my work. Now, you know, that doesn't mean he just kind of washes his hands, like God take care of the business, right? It's not going to work. He's still got to work hard. He's got to think. He's got to find the right people. He's got to get rid of the people that won't cooperate in a nice way, respecting their freedom. But in all of that, he's trying to pray. And he's trying to bring his thoughts, his reflections, into the work that he's doing. And it makes a difference.
What do you do if you're at the opposite end of the spectrum? You're talking about the CEO.
Yeah.
But what if you're an entry-level person or lower management?
Right.
And you're working for a firm and you see, because of the corporate greed,
Right.
and you're really uncomfortable with the way that employees are being treated.
Right.
Humanity, some of the human resources that you have.
Right. Well, the first thing is you have to do your work very well. Otherwise, nobody listens to you. You know, you got great ideas, but you don't do your work well, nobody cares. So you got to do your work well. Now, within that, you have respect for your fellow employees, and maybe you will have a chance someday to talk to your manager. because we become friends. It's not like there's this absolute level that we're in. We cross bounds, become friends. And then you can say, gee, the other day I was thinking about this thing that you did. And I was a little surprised myself. Why did you do that? And the guy says, well, I thought this or that. And you enter into a conversation. And it's through that friendship that you begin to talk about the true doctrine of the church. But as a friend, that he trusts you, not because you're going to tell him off. Telling people off doesn't work, ever, period. It's one of the things Thomas Jefferson discovered. He never told anybody off. It was against his personality. I'm reading his biography. I was very impressed. I never knew quite Thomas Jefferson, and it's very interesting. But that was one of his major things. He had a lot of strong ideas. He had temper underneath, but he never told people off. He knew it wouldn't work. And he knew he'd get farther along with time if he approached things that way. I say that, just as an aside, I say that because, to me, Archbishop Gomez has somewhat of the same personality. And sometimes people think that slows things down. I don't think so. I think in the end it speeds things up. Because eventually you see that things accelerate and then they become established in a good way that'll last a long time. And that's what Jefferson was interested in, establishing the United States of America, third president of the United States. And already, how do we make this country survive? Because the outside world was still trying to get the country under control. France, Britain, Spain, they were all kind of interested in what we had, and they wanted a piece of it. Yes?
There have been a lot of inflammatories at the moment. The new Pope has made a lot of statements, which people like The Nation magazine or the New Republic and stuff are doing handstands. And this guy's really a hard leftist.
Right.
And I thought you'd take us there. You started in 1891, and we didn't
Right.
quite get to him.
Right.
So what's your view on what's going on in there?
Well, I think there are a number of things. Number one is we have to wait. I know he's been there a little while already, but we have to wait. Because he hasn't revealed his whole hand yet. He's opening doors for us. But I think the second thing is that he has a perspective as an Argentine that's different from us and other parts of the world. We have to take that into
Very
account.
profoundly troubled country.
Right.
Should be a very rich country. And it's,
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
Because of lots of cultural reasons.
So the way I put it is it's got a lot of chiefs and no Indians. I mean, it's a lot of bosses and there's no workers. In a way. Now, he's into that environment. That's where he was brought up. He never set foot in the United States of America. So this trip is important for him on a certain level that we can't gauge, but it's important for him. So I think that there's a way that he's trying to wake us up, make us think. And he's not answering the questions, but he's throwing a lot of stuff out there that makes us confused at first. I think if you look at the doctrine across the board, not just the ones that the media talks about, because the media basically is against the Catholic Church. Los Angeles Times, we had 15,000 people, One Life LA, downtown, supporting life, sort of against abortion. There was zero in the LA Times. Not one little article, okay? A few days later, what's in the front page of the New York Times? Father Estrada. Big article about him, priest, left the priesthood, all this crazy stuff. You go inside, it's a half page more. What's going on? The media is against the Catholic Church.
Right.
So you can't depend on the media to tell you what's going on. I'll tell you somebody to read who will help you is John Allen. John Allen used to be a reporter for CNN, and outstanding reporter for CNN, and worked also for National Catholic Reporter. He is also now, he left that and he's working for the Boston Globe. And he's a brilliant guy, well plugged in, solid outlook. He has a thing called cruxnow.com. And it's a regular news thing. He does a lot of the articles, plus there's other people also contributing. But you read his articles, very, very profound. And he's talking about some of these issues that the Pope is looking at, like the whole issue of proselytism. The Pope keeps saying proselytism is bad, which is sort of a form of conversion. John Allen says, well, let's step back and look at the language he's using, and you realize, in a way, as an Argentine, the proselytism are the Protestants going into South America and proselytizing these people and bringing them out of the Catholic faith into certain areas. So for him, that's what he means. John Allen has a great sense of all this, getting behind the words. And if you look at the Pope's discourses, you get more of the picture than what you get from the encyclicals or what the media says. Because I'm often, and this is where he's confusing for some people, Cardinal George himself said he's confused, and he wanted to talk to him for an hour. But what happens is that he clarifies himself very well on the smaller level, like going to Manila, to the Philippines. It's very clear on the family, very clear on artificial contraception, across the board, solid as a rock. Now, some people say that he's allowed homosexuals now to enter into the church in a new way. It's not true. Now, you read the documents, it's not true. I mean, not the way they say it. And that's where I say we need time, we have to see what he's doing, but in the meantime, if you go to Vatican VA and you read, or you go to the Catholic News Agency or one of these things that put out his documents, you'd be amazed at stuff he's saying, which is different from the media and different sometimes what people would interpret in the encyclicals. So I'm waiting to see. I think he's definitely waking us up. And he said that, this is the year for religious. This year is for consecrated persons. And what does he tell the consecrated persons? Wake the world up. That's his basic phrase. Wake the world up. That's what they have to do. That's what we have to do as lay people as well. I mean, he focuses on the religious, the consecrated persons, but we all have the same world. Wake it up. Friendship, evangelization, deal with people, knowing these ideas and saying, well, this is the direction we have to go towards. In the old days, you memorized the Catechism of the Catholic Church. To me, it was a great thing, I'm still part of that generation. But nobody does anything anymore. I went to high school and there was no memorization of anything. We were totally lost come out of high school. So how are you going to evangelize anybody when you're totally lost? You don't know the doctrine. We have the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We have the Compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We have this book on social doctrine. We have all kinds of things now that can help us. And that all came, I think, from John Paul II, that he passed over and came directly to the people and not rested entirely on the in-between people. So he went everywhere. And then he told the doctrine himself. I think Pope Francis is doing something similar. When he first came in, it looked like he would not travel because of his age. Look at his travel schedule. This year he's got like 5 trips. I mean, he's doing the same thing, going out and shaking up the world. Yes?
If I understood you correctly at the outset, you said something to the effect that while we analyze most social issues, let's say abortion, in terms of traditional religious or Catholic analysis. We go to the Bible, we go to the teaching of the fathers, the councils, etc., etc. When it comes to economically related social issues, we take a philosophical approach, which probably accounts for the fact that we have a very firm position on abortion. Fifth Commandment says, thou shalt not kill. That means thou shalt not kill fetuses. When we get to something like the progressive income tax, on the other hand, even though we have a commandment that says thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not even think about taking what doesn't belong to you, we seem to have no problem, at least here in the States, with the progressive income tax. The reverend clergy does not
But I'm not interested in the
speak on that
progressive income
subject.
tax.
Pardon?
I'm not interested in the progressive income tax, because that's one way or another way you can employ the teaching of the church properly. Some people say the progressive income tax. That's a political decision. They're trying to find justice.
Well, that's my point. It no longer is a question of what the commandments provide. It's what the democratic populace
No,
provides.
you know what the commandments are? They're keys. They're
I'm
not
sorry?
laws, they're keys. They're keys that open doors for us. Everything in the commandments you can understand with your mind without ever hearing about God. You look at Aristotle. Aristotle was astounding. Thomas Aquinas depended totally on Aristotle. What are we talking about? All the things you talked about, we don't need doctrine, we don't need the fifth commandment, we don't need revelation, we don't need the catechism of the Catholic Church. They're useful, we don't need it. Not to kill has nothing to do with religious revelation. Not to kill is a natural fact of life that you can figure out with your own head that I cannot kill. It's great that there's a commandment that reminds me of that. But I don't need a commandment, especially us who are intelligent, to figure out that, no, I know that that's wrong. I have to do to others what they do to me. That's a logical way to be as a human being, as a social person in the middle of this society. It has nothing to do with the church's teaching. So we come into the church's teaching and it confirms us. It gives us more strength. It brings us down smaller alleyways than we can figure out, unless we're a very good philosopher or a very good theologian. Now that's what you're wrestling with. And I agree, abortion, we can figure out abortion without doctrine of the church. It's got nothing to do with thou shalt not kill. You can figure that out. Is that a human person or not? The DNA at the moment of conception, that moment, that DNA is the same DNA you have for the rest of your life. Now, we feel confirmed because Our Lady, when the angel comes to her, at that moment when she says yes, she's pregnant. And that means that that's God, not somebody else. That's wonderful. But we don't need that to figure out that abortion is wrong. And in politics, there may be many ways to answer some of the questions. Some are better than others. Depends on the environment. I think in certain countries, democracies are difficult because you don't have the educated environment to handle it. So there may be other ways of ruling the country. Our country, it is democratic. And I think sometimes we can't always think that we have to do things elsewhere as we do here, because we have to take into that culture to understand it. But that's got to do, again, with using our heads, not so much of just using the doctrine of the church. But they're not conflicting each other. And politically, there's many ways to answer some of the questions in different places. And that's why I say I'm not interested in progressive income tax. There may be other ways. And you want to vote for progressive income tax, you vote for these candidates of this party. And if you don't, you vote for these candidates of the other party that doesn't agree with that. That's politics.
But the issue here really is where politics supersedes the commandments, where politics takes over, where we're still stuck with the commandments. You mentioned, of course, abortion. Birth control, I submit, is a much more difficult issue.
I guess I don't fully see how politics is opposed. I think this is where we are the people. That's the United States. We are the people. We end up controlling politics. Politician serves the people. In the United States of America, it's become professional, maybe unfortunately, but the idea is that politics serves the people. And we're the people, and we have our ideas, and we bring those ideas to other people. And that's how they mesh. Politics isn't isolated or separate, coming up against the truth, or at times the truth, or the teaching of the church. This is where we have to make that connection. That's not there right now.
It's a mathematical certainty that there will always be a greater percentage of we the people who aren't making the top dollar in society, don't have the top economic
They don't, but
position
they
in
have a vote.
society.
They have a vote. And everybody has to
They
vote.
have a vote.
Everybody doesn't vote in this country.
They have a vote.
They have the
but
vote.
nobody
They have labor
instructs.
unions if they really have to go after things. They can enter the university and become a professor, and they change ideas on thousands of kids over the years. The people from 1968 that closed Columbia University, I entered at 70, and we were closed twice in the years that I was there. 68 was the big one. Those people, a lot of them weren't students of Columbia. They became television experts, controlling programs. What did the programs do to us? Nothing, really, generally. Turn on television. I never watch television, but I turn on and watch a show. It's horrendous. Those are the people. They're changing our morality by television. They run news programs. They're telling us what to think through news, which is really info news. It's not news. There's a great book by a man, it's Bob Greenberg, I forget, anyway, a book called Bias. He was Dan Rather's #2 guy under him, Jewish guy, pro-abortion, pro-homosexuality, across the board a liberal. He realized that the media was not serving the whole country the way it was. So we're dealing ways that the average person can break out of the box. You look at major newspapers in America. How many Catholics do you see in major newspapers in America? Not too many, you know, really. And the Catholics who are in politics, how many of them have been faithful to their Catholicism as Catholics in politics? So I begin to see out the world that we've lost the fight on ideas. We have to change that, but we lost the fight. Now we have to speed it up and get back into those areas. And those areas change the whole of society. Ideas is crucial. And that's where these people went. They went into, they write books. They're people who are understanding that we can change the whole society, even though we're a small person, because you write a good book that becomes a bestseller. And I mean, I'm always Da Vinci Code, as a priest of Opus Dei, I can tell you the book was a waste of time. Sold like 47 million copies. Did that guy have an effect? He did for a while. I think people realized the book is not that great and it sort of disappeared. But he had a huge effect. In a sense, he was attacking Opus Dei. I went onto Hardball with Chris Matthews. And you know, he hated Dan Brown, to tell you the truth. He just did not like him. He wouldn't interview him. And he was pretty upset with the book. And he's saying to me, what's going on? What's he talking about? And we talked about the book. It was a great interview, by the way. Chris Matthews can kill you, or he can like you. And if he wants to kill you, he can really kill you. But we hit it off. But you know, this one guy out of nowhere influences a great thing. Opus Dei, instead of fighting against it, we decided to go with it. The Wall Street Journal says you got to hire a good public relations firm. We didn't. We didn't. In the end, somebody asked one of the men in Italy and said, why don't you hire a public relations firm? He says, because in Italy, we make our spaghetti at home. And that's what we did. And I think we took advantage of it very well. And we were small people, you know, we're a small organization. Chris Matthews says, you guys are sort of secret, right? I mean, isn't that what the New York Times says and everybody else? I said, all right, let's look at it. We've got 300 million people in the United States, maybe 75 million are Catholics, and there's 3,000 people in Opus Dei. What is the chance that you're ever going to meet a member of Opus Dei? Pretty much zero if you get down to it. And he says, all right, I agree with that. You're small. I said, small, absolutely right. Now, if we were a couple of million, yeah, you'd know about us, but we're not. It's nothing to do with secrecy. It's just, that's reality. But we're a small organization, but the New York Times hates us. Wow, what's going on here? My father was a fireman, all right? So what's going on here? I mean, this is America. This is why I say my sister and brother-in-law standing at Ellis Island having champagne and thinking our grandparents would never imagine this ever happening. And that's what happened. And they're just ordinary people who worked hard and studied hard. So anyway, that's, you guys want to spend all day? I'm ready. Good, thank you very much. It was great talking to you. And again, if you have more questions, I'll hang around so you can ask me.